Welcome to Forbes Newsroom. Joining me now is Sara Dorn, politics reporter here at Forbes. Sara, thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Brittany. Thank you for having me.
Of course, there is a lot to discuss. Results are in from Georgia's tight runoff race for their one open Senate seat. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so this was the final race in the midterm Senate contest. Heading into Election Day, Democrats had already secured enough seats to retain control of the chamber. They had won 50 seats previously, which was kind of outperforming expectations, and Republicans held 49. So if Walker had won last night, the chamber would have been split 50-50, which is what it currently is. Democrats can use Vice President Kamala Harris's tie-breaking vote to, pass legislation, and now they do not need her vote. And they were empowered on a number of other fronts, just aside from the legislation. So this is a really big win for Democrats. And I can go on and on if you have specific questions. I'll wait.
This was definitely one of the most talked about races in this whole midterm cycle, and mainly to do with a lot of the scandals that plagued it. So can you give us a sense of what both Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock's campaigns looked like in these final days of the runoff election?
Absolutely. I mean, as I'm sure a lot of viewers are aware, there were two women who accused Herschel Walker of paying for their abortions after they claimed that he impregnated them. And he has been staunchly anti-abortion on the campaign trail. And he softened his stance a little bit in the final months of the campaign to say that he does support abortions with some exceptions. So that was, the overarching scandal that kind of cast a shadow over Walker's campaign. And then in the runoff campaign, another woman came forward, this time by name, lending her photos of her with Walker to the Daily Beast, to say that, he exhibited some violent and what she had described as terrifying behavior. So that was, a big hit against him less than a week before the runoff. And aside from that, Warnock's campaign really highlighted a lot of gaffes that he, had on the campaign trail. There was this missive about werewolves and vampires and him watching a movie that a lot of people talked about. And then, on Walker's side, they repeatedly attacked Warnock's character as well, and mentioned an incident with his now ex-wife where the police were called to his home. No charges were filed in that incident. And of course, for all Republicans, a major strategy was tying the Democrats to President Joe Biden, and who has, a relatively low favorability rating, and just concerns about the economy. So,
all that being said, was Warnock's victory a surprise?
Headed into election, anything can happen in politics. So I never like to make predictions or say anything was surprising, but headed into Election Day, one of the final polls showed Warnock leading by 5 points, and early voting turnout was very high for a runoff. A day or two ago, there were some 1.8 million people who had voted early, and early voters typically lean Democrat. And actually, there was a quote, I believe it was in Politico, from the Walker campaign, saying that, he acknowledging that they had to win 60% of the votes on Election Day to make up for that, estimated gap in the early vote turnout.
Governor Brian Kemp won re-election pretty handily against Stacey Abrams, somewhere in the ballpark of 7 points. So where did Herschel Walker go wrong in not being able to ride his coattails?
So Brian Kemp not being on the ballot in the runoff, a lot of politicos out there will say that hurt Herschel Walker because Republicans just stayed home. And MSNBC, elections guru Steve Kornacki had a very interesting tweet this morning that turnout for the runoff was 90% of November's level. But 5 of the 6 counties where turnout lagged compared to November were heavily Republican, which suggests that Walker suffered in terms of turnout because Kemp was not on the ballot, though Kemp did campaign for him.
Looking at this race as a whole, can you dive into why it's so pivotal?
Yeah, so as I mentioned previously, the Senate chamber is currently split 50-50. This gives Democrats 1 extra seat. It's now 51-49. They do not need Vice President Kamala Harris's tie-breaking vote to pass legislation, though there will likely be a legislative stalemate next year, given that the Congress is split between a Republican-controlled House and Democrat-controlled Senate. However, they do not need a power sharing agreement with Republicans now, which means the Democrats can retain control of committees, which, allows them to expedite or not expedite, but more easily pass judicial nominations and issue subpoenas and investigations. And it also, Joe Manchin, senator from West Virginia, was once called the king of the Senate because he holds so much sway as a moderate Democrat and that he often votes with Republicans. Democrats will not need, they can, afford to lose his vote. And Kristen Sinema, she was another moderate who sometimes voted with Republicans. So they don't need to appease and negotiate with them anymore to get a majority of votes to pass legislation. So it's definitely a big win for Democrats. And then, another thing is this caps off a string of defeats of candidates that former President Donald Trump supported. Democrats, most notably, I would say that in addition to this race, like the most notable race was Pennsylvania, where Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman, flipped the seat from red to blue, which was obviously, a huge deal for Democrats. And as we know, his opponent, Mehmet Oz, was backed by Donald Trump. And, similar circumstances in Arizona and Nevada, where Trump-backed candidates lost some very tight races.
I do want to speak to that. Why were these midterms worse than expected for Republicans?
I think that in the days before November 8th, we saw all of the forecasts, 538, Cook, Savato's crystal ball, they began to lean towards Republicans for the Senate and the House. Republicans are pointing the finger at Donald Trump and saying that this is largely a rebuke on election denialism and extremism in general. And, I would say that abortion, obviously, the reversal of Roe v. Wade played, a major role as well. Democrats campaigned heavily on that. But, in the end, I think that voters were just feeling some fatigue from the chaos of the Trump campaign and January 6th. And, a lot of the candidates who lost were staunchly pro-Trump and, even helped him deny the results of the 2020 presidential election. So I think that voters were just, looking to avoid that drama, and concerns about the economy, inflation, gas prices weighed heavily on their minds, rather than making a political statement by electing someone who, is aligned with Donald Trump and, is more geared toward, I would say, messaging rather than, and again, making a statement rather than, addressing some of these issues that, in a lot of the races that, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, those were all incumbents, experienced legislators Democrats who beat Republicans. So, voters had previous faith in them as well. So
the Georgia race here was the last unresolved race of the midterms, so we can finally put a pin in the midterms of 2022. But a theme, like you were saying, was by and large, Trump-backed candidates didn't fare well. So do you think that this is going to be the thing that finally makes the GOP pivot away from Donald Trump?
I mean, we have seen a lot of Republican leaders criticize his various controversies in recent weeks. The dinner with Nick Fuentes at Mar-a-Lago, who was a known white supremacist. Over the weekend, Trump suggested that parts of the Constitution should be revoked and he should be reinstated as president because they did not help him be reelected in 2020. Again, all of these things, a broad coalition of Republicans came out against him, but there were still some who, declined to say that they wouldn't support him in 2024, and even some, Mitch McConnell, for example, in discussing his dinner with Fuentes, he denounced anti-Semitism, but he didn't specifically named Trump. And same with Kevin McCarthy. He said that no one should have dinner with Nick Fuentes, but he didn't specifically name Trump. So I think that a lot of Republicans are waiting to see what happens because he does still have a broad coalition of support that, it seems that nothing can really shake. And on the other hand, there are a lot of Republicans who are considering runs against him in 2024. And there are some fears within the party that this is setting up a similar circumstance to 2016, where the more moderate establishment vote will be dispersed through, a wide base of other candidates, and Trump's base will rally around him and catapult him to the nomination. So it's really a wait and see game right now.
I do want to talk about the future a little bit. So these midterms, Republicans really focused on key messaging about the economy, inflation, safety, things like that. But by and large, they didn't get that red wave that they thought was going to materialize. So do you think this message will shift within the next 2 years?
So yes, it's expected to be a very contentious 2 years in Congress, with the House being controlled by Republicans, the Senate being controlled by Democrats. Not a lot of legislating is expected to be done. But House Republicans have already announced a number of investigations that they have planned into the Biden administration, everything from Ukraine spending to COVID-19 policies to probes of his son, Hunter Biden. So that could really draw a lot of, Republican support and attention, and yes, get the attention of voters. At the same time, it could put a distaste in Democrats' mouths, and they could, it could rile their base, and they could come out and vote in bigger numbers just as a rebuke on these issues, and in hopes of, making real progress rather than, legislative investigations are often seen as a waste of time. Like even the January 6th investigation, the polls will find that a lot of Americans are ready to be done with that and are a bit exhausted by it. On the other hand, we have two new leaders in the House. Hakeem Jeffries will be the minority leader, and Kevin McCarthy is expected to be the new House Speaker to replace Nancy Pelosi. They have historically not had a great relationship, so they will have to forge a new working relationship. But so far, the rhetoric from Republicans has been, we're really going to come after Democrats and take advantage of this. It's a slim majority, but take advantage of this majority in the House to, reverse or deliver a rebuke on Democratic policies that have been enacted over the past 2 years.
I do want to ask you about Kevin McCarthy. Does this latest GOP loss make his fight to become Speaker harder?
It's in the Senate, so and he is vying for House Speaker, so it's a different chamber. But yes, I mean, it certainly does not look good for Republicans. And up until Election Day, he was really a shoo-in to become the next speaker. And the Republican losses, it allowed the House Freedom Caucus, which is, a coalition of right-wing lawmakers. They saw this slim majority in the House as an opening for them to put up their own candidate, who just formally announced yesterday. And yes, and challenge McCarthy, negotiate with him to have rules changes and all kinds of things that they, want in exchange for the speaker votes. So it definitely doesn't look good for him. And I would say that, from a legislating perspective, it hamstrings Republicans even more, even in the House, just because the Senate can, draw up support and for pieces of legislation, investigations, nominees, and then the House could be forced to take those on, which really just gives Kevin McCarthy a lot more to do and makes his job a bit harder.
And what happens if Kevin McCarthy doesn't get those 218 votes that he needs?
Yes. If one candidate, Andy Biggs, is the House Freedom Caucus, he's the former chair who is running against Kevin McCarthy, announced his candidacy yesterday, and he was nominated in November, but he lost in the closed door vote, and McCarthy is the official nominee. So if one of them does not receive 218 votes in the first round of voting, it will go to another round of voting until one candidate reaches the 218 vote threshold. It's very unlikely that Biggs achieves that, but his multiple rounds of voting for a speaker has not happened in 100 years. So it could be very embarrassing for Kevin McCarthy, who has had speaker aspirations, since for years. And it would just, hinder his standing within the party before he even takes control. And as I mentioned, it's a very hard job wrangling this slim majority that he's faced with. So, I mean, the headlines have just been crazy, like Kevin McCarthy's hell. It is one that comes to mind just in this contentious House, and amid all of this Republican infighting that we currently have going on right now. But at the end of the day, he is likely to become the next speaker. Just the process for getting there is a lot tougher road than Republicans were expecting before November 8th.
Got it. There's definitely a lot for us to keep our eye on. And Sara, I hope you come back and give us updates as they come, which seem to be happening, almost every day. Sara Dorn, thank you so much.
Thanks, Brittany.